Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 378, and it's March the 2nd, 1979, and this is side one of our tape. I have enclosed for you, with the tape this week, some information about radio programs. I didn't used to announce these programs on the tapes because they would be outdated by the time I got on. But these are regular programs that I've been doing once a month, an update of the news, and people living in the San Francisco area or Marin County or San Jose, San Carlos or Berkeley can catch the KXRX shows that I do with Lynn Ryder. We just did one last week, and I'll be back again next month on March 26th. You can write to Lynn at KXRX and tell her you enjoyed it if you heard the show, or you can write and ask that she continue this weekly series, because we are reaching a lot of people and more people begin to take the tape cassettes, and it's important to get the information out that I've researched, and I think you agree with that. So people living in that area can mark the calendar and know that I'll be back on the 26th. I'll be back in Berkeley at KPFA with Mama O'Shea in April. For the next month, they're doing a series of fundraising shows, and I'm going to be up there doing one on the SLA, but I don't know what date. They're covering the last 30 years of tapes, and we will be back. But I think Mama Shea will have tape cassettes or reels of the shows that we did together. We've done about 4 so far broadcasts, and people are writing here for the information. Write to her. I don't have copies of the cassettes. You'll have to get in touch with her on that. Also, in New York City, I used to go there and lecture at the Elgin Theater and on WBAI, and had a large following in New York City, and then Mark Lane was instrumental, along with Alexander Cockburn from the Village Voice, of ending my radio communication in New York. That's been a couple of years now. WBAI changed locations. They literally were hanging on a shoestring, broke. Their news has been terrible. The station has just held on by a thread, and various people who take these tapes in New York City have offered them money for telephone calls and news. So when I got a call from Lynn Samuels this week to do a 2-hour show with BAI in New York, it was really great, and one of the listeners, as I say, who takes this tape, said they would give them $20 to call here, and maybe we can begin a once-a-month talk show back to New York City. I used to have a tremendous audience there that was really catching on to what was happening, my interpretation at least, and I think now as news events come closer, they can remember some of the things I said and are on the verge of panic. Literally, they call, and so if we can open up the communications from California to New York, maybe weekly or monthly, who knows, we can get this information out even faster, and goodness knows we have to do that. One subject now, which I hate to bring up, but the price of tapes is going to be $4 a tape now instead of $3.50. That's plus the California tax if you order in California. As I explained on the sheet, I've been paying for the printed material. I do the research and buy the books, magazines, newspapers, correspond, answer the letters, answer the long-distance phone calls, and the expenses are tremendous. And I can only go in the hole so much. I can't keep piling up debts, or else I have to stop the research. And the printing sheets each week are very expensive. They range from $9 to $18 a week just to get the sheets out that I give to the tape center to enclose with the tapes. And I'm paying for that out of my own money, so that the cost of the tape covers the tape, and then the printed sheet is coming from my own pocket. And it's just getting too expensive to send out those sheets, and I think they're very valuable. So if you've ordered, some people have ordered tapes and paid through up to July. A lot of people have paid up through July, so they lucked out. The price stays the same, and their orders are filled at $3.50 a tape up through July, and then there's some paid up through May and June. But the next time you order, any order, it's going to have to be $4 a tape to cover the printing costs. That's the only way I can do it. So I'm sorry, I hate to do it, but it's just one of those things that we have to do. Now, back to the business of the day. This is called the updated news again, like last week. There's too many things in the news to ignore that are tied into past tapes, and we don't want to lose their threads. There are 2 other items single items that I do want to call attention to before we get on to the update of the news also. An article in the Los Angeles Times, and this is from February 21st, 1979, by Robert Rawich. Los Angeles Times, the head of the article says, head of arms firm admits a record-keeping violation. The lawyer calls these offenses technical. The case involves 1,299 guns and 5.3 million rounds of ammunition. Now, what this article is saying is that the president of a Santa Ana firm that's the major supplier for weapons and ammunition to law enforcement agencies pleaded guilty that he kept bad book records. And this is important. The implications of this is so important. He makes ammunition for the Los Angeles Police Department, but he failed to keep his proper record when he received 1,299 handguns and the sale of 5.3 million rounds of ammunition. Howard Morris, 68, of California Electronic Police Equipment Company, was the target of a search in late 1977 because of a huge black market operation involving firearms. The company conceded that they kept sloppy records, this is a quotation, that many weapons are unaccounted for, some were stolen by employees, some weapons were purchased by this owner of the ammunition firm and given as gifts to friends. Now, he makes weapons for the Los Angeles Police Department, and he gave them to the friends in law enforcement without filing appropriate transfer forms. This is a situation of a business, Mr. Cohn said, the lawyer, that grew too fast. It just simply grew too fast. On over 50 different occasions, from 1975 to 1977, that's a 2-year period here, 1975 to 1977, the company failed to make appropriate entries in their record regarding the acquisition of 1,299 handguns from Smith & Wesson. During the same period, they failed to record the sale of 338 firearms and 5.3 million rounds of ammunition. And Mr. Morris was charged with a single count of knowingly making false statements on firearm transaction records, for which he could be sentenced to 5 years in prison or get a fine of $10,000. Now, there are weapon stockpiles down at Jonestown. There are weapon stockpiles all over the world. This is a man that makes weapons for the LAPD. They could go to right-wing paramilitary groups, law enforcement persons on their own. He calls it a bookkeeping error. So even if this man went to jail for 5 years, which I doubt he would do, most white-collar crimes don't, and even if he paid $10,000, they haven't asked who were the friends and where did it go if you didn't enter it in your book. Now, when they have a figure like 1,299 handguns, how do we even know that it isn't 3,000? Remember, they counted 408 bodies in Jonestown, and it was 910. If Jim Jones got one bullet in the head that undid and silenced all of the mischief that preceded him, or a Lee Harvey Oswald got one bullet in the body, or Martin Luther King got one bullet, 5 million rounds, if you aim right, would kill everyone in Los Angeles and almost San Francisco combined. Do you realize what 5.3 million rounds of ammunition are when they're unaccounted for in the hands of law enforcement agents, and guns that are unregistered, properly recorded, manufacturing for the police department? Now, what happens when they catch this man? They don't stop contracts. I'm sure he's still manufacturing for the police department. And every gun he makes, he could give 2 away. He could make 3 weapons and put on the books that he made 1. This person has put out on the streets, literally, 338 firearms unregistered, another 1,299 handguns, as if he's such a sloppy record keeper, how do you have the exact number, and 5.3 million rounds of ammunition. Now, I stress this article because I know we're going to have riots in the streets. I know we're going to have bloody riots. I've been working to tell you these things are coming down ever since the assassination of John Kennedy. It involves the private police forces, such as Mr. Perot, who went over to Iran this week, not this week, 2 weeks ago, to free 2 employees that he had for his computer work and let 11,000 men out of a jail in order to get 2. The alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, the FBI, the Immigration Department doesn't question his interfering with a foreign matter. Can you imagine somebody from another country breaking into San Quentin and Folsom and releasing every prisoner in order to get 2 out? What we would do if a team that was armed came in and released every person in our prisons. Can you imagine the repercussions of interfering with another country? But private police force can do this, and this man has distributed that much ammunition, and I promise you that it's going to come back someday. It's going to come back in the form of fire on the streets, and it's this kind of thing which is reported in the Los Angeles Times. Note, it wasn't the Associated Press, it wasn't the United Press or Reuters. It's an example, and I'm going to cite it many, many times on these tapes, of a single news story hitting a single town. And if you find it anywhere else, let me know. Send me an article. But if you didn't live in Los Angeles and you didn't know all this ammunition were out there, you may feel safe visiting the city of the angels, but you may end up one of those angels someday when that ammunition goes around. So that's the kind of company that manufactures for the police department that attributes the handing out of that kind of ammunition to sloppy bookkeeping, never going into the politics or the intention of Howard Morris or his political alignment or his affiliation, or whether he's a states' rights member or the member of the Nazi Party or the Ku Klux Klan or an informant for the FBI or paid by the CIA to do this. This much ammunition is out on the streets, and the man simply said, well, we'll fine you or we'll put you away, and because he pleaded guilty, he probably won't even be put into jail. I got a letter from QM Dabney and Company. They're in Washington, D.C. They carry books, hard-to-find books, and I got a letter from them this week saying that they have available a copy of the original edition of the Warren Report. It's $15, and the Warren Commission hearings, 26 volumes, it's $650. I don't know anybody listening to these tapes who wants to put up that money, $650, but there may be a group of you who listen together. I know there are pockets of individuals in various cities who share the tapes and listen, and if you can get together as a group and put up the money, you can write to me or call Dabney and Company in Washington, D.C. There is a Warren Report, and there also are the 26 volumes of the Commission hearings, if you want to order them. The newspapers this week had pictures of Auschwitz. The United States intelligence agencies had pictures that they took of the Auschwitz death camp that they turned over to the CIA after the CIA was formed in 1947. And it shows a photo reconnaissance of the IG Farben synthetic and rubber works, the oil and rubber works, which they claimed was a bombing target less than 5 miles from Auschwitz. But those of you who are fortunate enough to take a newspaper which has a map of Auschwitz also shows you the town of Krakow, close by where our dear Pope John Paul II lived. And he said at the time of his becoming well known as a pope that he had worked at a chemical factory in Krakow, close to Krakow. And he never named the chemical factory, except one person named it on the air discussing the Pope where he worked. And the account that I heard, it was on a broadcast, not an article, was that he worked at the Solvay quarry. Newsweek said that Pope John Paul II was a factory worker. These stories tell you how the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, and Pope John Paul II was 19 years old. He was described in Newsweek as a factory worker during the war, wanted by the Nazis. Time magazine called him a quarryman and a factory worker in his youth. There were other articles. Another San Francisco Chronicle article said in his youth he did clandestine theater under a pseudonym. He took a trip, lectured in the United States and Australia, but during the war He worked in a chemical factory. The UPI story, October 16th, 1978, he worked in a chemical factory and earned his way through the Polish seminary. Pardon me. That's a slip of the tongue. I won't even change that one on the tape. Another UPI story given to me by a researcher up north, October the 17th. The new pope saw his father, a non-commissioned officer, slain when the stormtroopers came in, and he was forced by the German occupiers to work in a chemical factory in Krakow. Well, this last week they showed Krakow and IG Farben and Auschwitz, the compound just miles from each other. And Look magazine described, this is March 1979, came out with a picture of the Pope with a sombrero, saying that he looked like he was election campaigning, and they have him posed with his classmates, and the article makes him out very genial and very simple. And then it goes on to say in this present Look magazine that he worked as a laborer in a Polish chemical factory during the war and started a clandestine theatrical group that presented the work of Polish romanticists. It goes on to say when the Nazis discovered he helped Jews escape, he was forced to go underground. Now, the only underground in Poland from 1939 until 1945, when the Russians came and ended these concentration camps, was for IG Farben, the same people that owned the chemical factory. They had a network of underground activity, and the underground that they're talking about involved the IG Farben espionage system that had agents all over the world. In a book, Cartels in Action, it describes, this is by Myron Watkins, written in 1946, it describes the Solvay process company which was begun in Virginia in the United States, Hopewell plants in 1928, formed by Ernest Solvay. And then the Solvay company changed during World War II. It became affiliated and linked to IG Farben Industries, and they both held stock in Ossiger Veran and in German Solvay Company. The IG Farben and Solvay were members of the German Soda Syndicate and the Alkali Syndicate that made gunpowder. So that if he worked for the Solvay Chemical Company, he worked for IG Farben because they were one and the same. Another book on IG Farben describing the rape of the European chemical industry tells how the Nazis went into Austria, Czechoslovakia, and IG Farben studied the chemical plants of the Czechoslovakia, particularly those owned by Ossinger Veran. That's the Solvay company that John Paul II worked for, the largest chemical company in Czechoslovakia. And once again, it tells how IG dealt with Ossinger Veran when the Nazis went into Poland. The IG Farben took over all chemical plants. The most important chemical plants in Poland were taken over by IG Farben, and the Solvay company that John Paul II worked for was IG Farben, and they had a good part in making gunpowder and also in making the gases, the chemicals that were exterminating the Jews in Auschwitz, the camp that sent the laborers to the IG Farben factory. They had to walk 5-6 miles each day into the snow, barefoot or whatever, until they dropped dead or were whipped. And they used the slave labor from Auschwitz until, as I say, they collapsed. They didn't feed them. They had them working until they died, and then they brought in the next gang. A book, All Honorable Men, by James Martin, written in 1950, discusses the relationship of the Belgian Solvay and company with IG Farben and the Nazis and the Krupp organization and Himmler and Goering. Another book, Treason's Peace, talks about the Solvay company and IG Farben. Farben was named as a co-conspirator along with the Solvay process owned by Allied Chemical and Dye from its Belgian namesake Solvay AC. And these German-owned companies took over the American chemical branches that were all over the world, and the Solvay company was incorporated into the IG Farben compound. Farben was the partner and was responsible, as I say, for the final solution that was going on. These aerial photographs show that they knew as early as 1944 that the trains marched these people in. The United States government knew it. The Vatican knew it. If they had bombed the railroads, 1 million people wouldn't have died. But in 1943, the Nazis were making agreements with Allen Dulles, the United States government, to come to our side and split us against Russia. And they were all anti-Semitic. The idea was to get rid of as many Jews as possible before the peace term was signed. So 1 million Hungarian Jews died in that interim. The United States government, the British, the French, they all knew what was going on. There were several people that had escaped and gone and told the heads of our government and the Vatican and other governments in Switzerland what was happening. And Auschwitz was not bombed. 1 million Jews were left on these train loads, just siphoned in. And the Pope worked in that area. And if you don't study the link of the Pope to Auschwitz and to I.G. Farben counterintelligence and how other people were taken out of houses and he was spared, as I say, the only underground theater during Nazi times was for I.G. Farben and for agents that later became part of the Farben network. And that's why Mr. Brzezinski, the Polish head of our National Security Council, can handpick this Pope John Paul II, because he has been tested and true and has worked right close to that. And the story that he helped Jews escape cannot be documented or proven. I challenge it. And the way the world is going now, I don't think you should sit back and accept that as the truth. I think it's far from the truth. And he's a very political pope. And right now he's wearing sombreros and kissing babies and marrying poor people. And a book of his will be out soon, and a play on television, The Literary Pope. But watch his political statements. Don't watch what he wears or who he kisses or where he travels. Just listen to what he says to the Catholic people who are asking for serious answers to political questions now. Forget the Brahu and listen carefully, and then think of where he worked from the time he was 19 years old until the war was over. And then he went to Rome to be the protege of the Secretary of the Vatican, Montini, who then became the Pope, who at that time, when the war was over, was writing those false documents and passports for Nazis to escape to Hong Kong, Middle East, South America, all over the world. He was a protege of Montini, who was working with the Milan Mafia, the organized crime, the CIA, and this isn't a tape explicitly on the Pope. We've done 3, and I want to do another one on the Vatican and I.G. Farben, but we were interrupted when Jonestown came down, and we'll get back to it. But when I see all the Brahu and pictures of him and the press releases every single day, something about that Pope. See, the most publicized Pope and the most gentle and the kissing the ground and the humility is to compensate for what really went on before. So look for the images and look how the press is playing him up. By the time you find anything good on him, people will say, well, how can you talk about him? Look how warm and loving he is, and he's helping all these poor people and marrying these little insignificant persons in the Sistine Chapel and doing all these gracious little things of humbling himself. Go to the background, and then you'll know the future. If you understand the past and how he got away with what he did and where he worked and what he saw, if he lived in that town right next to Auschwitz in a chemical factory owned by Farben, he shouldn't be so violently anti-communist, because the communists ended the Nazi rule or regime in Poland. And considering the many camps set up in Poland against the Jews and the mass extermination that took place on Polish soil, not German soil, he would be violently anti-Nazi. He wouldn't be working with the Nazis today, which is what he's doing. Now, an update on the Rockefeller murder. Last week, on the tape last week or the week before, talking about Nelson Rockefeller, I suggested that that expensive property on 54th Street that Megan Marshak lived at with Ponchitta Pierce could have been a call house for ambassadors and for oil contracts, and that Megan Marshak was the hostess at Nelson Rockefeller's home, setting up seating arrangements and at the front of the line for various visiting ambassadors, and that she was on 24-hour call. So I think it was interesting this week. United Press had a story, Blackmail of Congressmen, Iranian Payoffs Reported. This article claims that the Iranian embassy in Washington, D.C., and the Shah of Iran sent money over for blackmailing, and that they entertained with payoffs, bribery, provisions of luxury, overseas travel accommodations, gifts ranging from caviar and champagne to substantial cash payments for prostitution and blackmail to members of our Congress. They referred to the Shah of Iran and the former ambassador Ardashir Zahedi, and it would make Koreagate look like, I believe your term is, peanuts. Now you remember the payoff in Japan of Lockheed, and also Prince Bernhard from Lockheed over the Netherlands, was paid in the bookkeeping records as peanuts. I think that's interesting. But this article claims that some representative from the government of Iran has told a congressman that the Shah had blackmailed and provided prostitutes for U.S. government officials and journalists. You see, our free press is very free. You wonder why all the press in New York City is stopping the investigation of the Rockefeller murder, or the press all over the country, or the various ambassadors and so forth, ambassadors. But they're talking about a wide-scale payoff, which is much bigger than Koreagate. Now, we know there was the Howard Hughes payoff of all the members of Congress, the Korean CIA funding members of Congress and the media, and Iran funding them. But you see, Iran is a country that has siphoned their oil to Nelson Rockefeller, the Standard Oil, Exxon Company, and Rockefeller had art objects in a house filled for visiting dignitaries, and even though he visited there and sent flowers and visited often, I am sure that if his wife gave the approval for Meghan Marshak to have this expensive apartment, and Ponchitta Pierce was an employee at one time of Rockefeller, and we'll go into that, I'm sure that the ambassadors had a jolly good time, and that those walls have ears. And I think that the hint now of the prostitution and blackmail of newspaper men and government officials, as far as the Iranian entertainment field goes, should be investigated in Washington and also in New York City, because New York City is the heart of Theaterland, Rockefeller Center, entertainment, and so forth. And I suggested that this 24-hour call of these women could be to meet these people at airports and pick them up and take them to the theater and so forth. So I think that the newspaper journalists and the government officials should be exposed. I would hope that somebody such as the Watergate agent who left the Scotch tape on that door would begin spilling these stories so we could find out just how this government is run. I have said a long time, it's run by bullets and blackmail, and there's just a hint of that coming out right now. Not enough. Now I want to talk about Meghan Marshak and her friend Ponchitta Pierce, because I didn't have time on the tape last week to get into that. But the mysterious woman who made the call, come to 911, hurry, she didn't say it was Nelson Rockefeller. You recall her name is Ponchitta Pierce, and Meghan Marshak called Ponchitta at her apartment and said Nelson Rockefeller had a heart attack, come down. She didn't call 911, and I mentioned on the tape last week that I believe Ponchitta Pierce was an agent of the CIA that could, or the Defense Department, or a private agent that could be the control, similar to Catherine Hart, that I've talked about on the John Paisley tapes. Catherine Hart was the CIA control agent over Marianne Paisley, and I felt that Ponchitta was called by Meghan Marshak because she had to say, I did the job. Ponchitta looked at it, agreed, okay, called 911 and went out. They said, did you know if he was alive or dead? She says, I didn't even ask. Well, the New York Times, February the 9th, 1978, has an article that Ponchitta Pierce was a 36-year-old television personality appointed by Rockefeller in 1968 to a study commission on news media and broadcasting. 1968 is an interesting year. You remember that's the year that Robert Kennedy was killed in the Ambassador Hotel in June 1968. Martin Luther King was killed April of 68. Richard Nixon won the election in 68. And Meghan Marshak's friend, Ponchitta Pierce, was beginning to work for Nelson Rockefeller in 1968 in New York City. But Ponchitta Pierce, like Meghan and Meghan's boyfriend, that I mentioned last week or the week before, David Lustig, also came from California. Now, there's a description of her in the New York Times. Miss Pierce, an award-winning journalist and a 1964 cum laude graduate of the University of California. Again, keep the dates, they're important. 1964, graduate of the University of California, was born in Chicago in 1942. She worked for Ebony magazine, assistant editor, associate editor, editor in charge of the New York office. She was a CBS News special correspondent. You remember the CBS also was exposed as being a conduit of the CIA. She joined WNBC. She was a correspondent from 1968 to 1971, and she joined NBC in 1973. Now we have those 2 missing years. Dan White in San Francisco had 2 years where he was missing in San Francisco from 1969 to 1971 when he left the police department. Then he came back to San Francisco and had a lot of money at that time. It said Miss Pierce was working for McCall's magazine and the Reader's Digest. She was the author of a 1968 report on status of American women journalists. I'm going to talk on the other side of this tape about her missing years, her work with Reader's Digest. We'll talk about the California connection to the murder of Nelson Rockefeller and what it means in terms of Ronald Reagan, as I say, running for the presidency and probably getting it in 1980. Side 2 of tape number 378, March the 2nd. It's made Brussels and Carmel, California, and we'll continue on the Rockefeller murder and an update of the news. I want to make a correction on side 1 of the tape. I said that Ponchitta Pierce came from the University of California. I meant to say the University of Southern California because that makes a great big difference. I also had mentioned on other tapes that I believe that blackmail could be used with the ambassadors, and I referred to the Tony Laswitz operation, the man that worked for Richard Nixon, who had cameras available to photograph the women that had been at Chappaquiddick and other agents through walls to use sex as a blackmail, and wondered if Laswitz was tied up to the Rockefeller scene. There was an allegation at the time of the Watergate stories that Tony Laswitz was on a ferry boat in Michigan with Arthur Bremer before Bremer took a shot at Wallace at the time of the 1972 elections. It always stayed in a rumor category, but it could have been pursued much, much farther. Mary Jo Kopechne's body was pulled out of a car up at Chappaquiddick in the water there, and Tony Laswitz was up at Chappaquiddick immediately. He was posed as a newspaper man, and he worked for Richard Nixon and E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy and the White House plumbers to frame and embarrass Ted Kennedy, and he was described in the book The Nightmare Decade as being the person asking embarrassing questions at the news conference and reporting them back by telephone and trying to get everything dirty he could dig up on Ted Kennedy at Chappaquiddick. Well, Tony Laswitz didn't work in a vacuum. He worked with a lot of other people, and many of them that hired him and worked with him all went to the University of Southern California, were all there around the time that Ponchitta Pierce was there. One of those was Donald Segretti, who, I'm quoting from Nightmare Decade, this particular book by Mr. Lucas about the White House plumbers, describes Segretti as a man who didn't have much money, whose background was fairly simple, but in late 71 he was sporting a $6,000 white Mercedes sports car, which the CIA gave him, and he worked for a Los Angeles law firm as a cover, but that was actually a cover for the CIA, and that he was dating and having open houses and California parties and a lot of women. And he graduated from USC in 1963. Ponchitta Pierce was at the University of Southern California cum laude in '64, but they were all there at the same time. And then he went on to Bolt Hall at Berkeley, and then to work for the Treasury Department in counterintelligence. The motive, Segretti said, he was the son of a hotel bellhop, and he was determined to make a splashy career for himself. And as soon as he got out of college, he met with his USC friends that were there with him when he went to school, Dwight Chapin and Gordon Strom of the Dirty Tricks Department, the sex blackmail department, the team of Richard Nixon's. Now keep in mind that the Howard Hughes, Summa people, and Ronald Reagan people that put in Nixon are anti-Rockefeller, and this team was pulling these tricks and going to school. They were pulling these and going to school at the University of Southern California as a body. They congregated there and then went on to the White House. And Ponchitta Pierce was at the campus at the same time and then goes on to work for Reader's Digest, which we'll get to in a minute. Another advertising man just out of USC, Harry Robbins Haldeman, followed Nixon's career since the days of Alger Hiss. As a USC student, newspaper was purged of so-called red influence. He worked his way up and then got into politics on the campus at USC and then worked for J. Walter Thompson, the same public relations firm that's tied into Mullen and Company in Washington, D.C. that was involved with Watergate, and also Thompson is the public relations firm that represents or did the San Francisco Police Department. He worked with the accounts of 7-Up, Walt Disney, Black Flag, and so forth. Another man, Herbert Porter, who reported G. Gordon Liddy, was a team member who went to University of California with Dwight Chapin, Gordon Strong, Ron Ziegler, and Segretti, and he originally, in 1970, he went from USC to a small computer company in Phoenix, and in 1964, when Ponchitta Pierce left USC cum laude, she goes back east, works with Ebony and CBS and NBC, and in 1968, she's working with Nelson Rockefeller, on the staff with Nelson Rockefeller, and Herb Porter is already, Herbert Porter is distributed to Phoenix, and one day he gets a call from a USC friend in Washington and tells him to arrange Nixon's trip, and Herbert Porter is part of the Nixon team. And they could count on him, as I say. Ron Ziegler came from Kentucky, moved to California. He transferred to the USC campus. He was a B marketing major and active in the Young Republicans. And when Nixon came to USC in 1960, he was campaigning against John Kennedy at the time. This Ron Ziegler helped him with that campaign, and then was hired by Bob Haldeman to go to J. Walter Thompson and also worked for that account. So that the USC campus was literally buzzing with counterintelligence agents that were displaced to other people. They were there around the same period that Ponchitta Pierce was, and then she goes on to work for Ebony magazine and then goes to work for the Reader's Digest also. And there are these two missing years, 1971 to 73, that might explain where she might have possibly gotten some intelligence training and activity. The Howard Hughes name comes up in all of my research because, for those of you who don't know the past work that I've done on Hughes, is my belief that the Hughes organization has been the cover for the CIA and for the assassination teams through the years. It's the umbrella that can't be touched because of its defense contracts. There was a show on TV this week, February 27th, 1978, the 2020 show by Hidalgo Rivera on Howard Hughes, and it has to do with that lawsuit, the seclusion of Hughes and the drugging of Hughes that I mentioned last week on the tape. But it showed Bill Gay, the mastermind behind the Hughes organization, the faceless man who's rarely photographed and will give no comments to the press, who was originally just a chauffeur and driver for Howard Hughes. And Bill Gay is was until he was kicked out, and now he's being sued for $50 million, along with the others, was the faceless power behind this huge operation. But it showed him in a car leaving his Encina, California home. Now, Megan Marshak lives in Encina, California. Her family came from there, and her father was angry at Richard Nixon for dropping the aerospace contracts. Her boyfriend, fiancé, that did photographic work at Nelson Rockefeller's home and also down to his estate in Venezuela, David Lustig, came from Encino, California, and Ponchitta Pierce came from the University of Southern California that was working with Richard Nixon. And I think if you pursue the Paul Laxalt management, Senator Paul Laxalt's management of the Ronald Reagan Fund Drive, you would find in this whole can of worms the same network that's been pulling this chicanery for years of bullets and blackmail during the time of elections or preceding them. Howard Hughes was the major contributor to Richard Nixon's career starting from his very early days, and the Howard Hughes that we know, or the person that wasn't seen since 1957, had selected on paper Paul Laxalt as the next president, but Laxalt is managing Reagan's campaign. But that scene of Bill Gay in Encino reminded me of Marshak and Lustig, David Lustig, and then Ponchitta Pierce down at USC, is an important area to investigate in terms of the espionage in the Rockefeller demise. Not that I think Rockefeller is perfect. I think he was terrible, and we can do a whole show on his combination of Sterling drug and IG Farben and Nazi connections. But the point is that even as bad as he is, his power is now neutralized, and another team holds the atomic bombs or doomsday bombs in their little fingers. Now, there's an important article in the New York Times. I don't know if you saw it. If you didn't, go to the library and get it. February the 24th, 1979, on how Richard Nixon tried to mold the public broadcasting, and how he turned it into something that would shape the future, which is exactly what I know RKQED does now. And it tells how Richard Nixon stopped the newscast of Sandy Van Oker and Robert McNeil, and how he called in the large corporations and told them to put on cultural shows and eliminate the political, that there shouldn't be politics, funding for public broadcasting if you do politics. And this is why we get Exxon and Mobil and Ford Foundation putting on our ballet, and nothing serious really coming over there. One of the first serious shows I saw last week was on Paul Jacobs. But the man who was writing the memos for Richard Nixon, a Mr. Whitehead, who was writing the memos on cutting off federal funds to national educational television, neutralizing it from any political effect, or 200 non-commercial FM radio stations. The man whose name is signed to these, a Mr. Whitehead, whose name is mentioned in these memos of Richard Nixon's, Mr. Whitehead left the broadcasting department of Richard Nixon to work, where would you guess he's working? For the Howard Hughes Satellites Company right now. He was reached by phone as president of the Hughes Satellite Corporations. Now, maybe you don't remember, I mentioned briefly on a tape a while back the Howard Hughes Medical Institute forming now in Boston, Los Angeles, with 12 satellite communications. I believe they will outdo Auschwitz any day, and they'll be connected by satellite communication where the government should have been out of the medical business, because the Hughes organization is nothing but a CIA operation. And look what happened to that body they cashed in, if you see how they took care of that, the one that was supposed to be used. But the point is that Mr. Whitehead, the same man that was working to stop public broadcasting of 280 non-commercial television stations and 200 non-commercial FM radio stations, he's now in charge of the Hughes Satellite Corporation. And what they did was they attempted, it says, to kill the news sources and shape the future of public broadcasting. They had two goals: either kill public broadcasting in the way it's going, or shape its future. And they decided to shape its future would be easier, so they reached to the foundations to support all the cultural material. And that's why you get Bill Moyer of the CIA on public broadcasting giving his talk shows, and Marilyn Baker covering the lies about the SLA when it was really the CIA, or people like Burt Marshall and Ramsey Clark being on the board of directors of the Vera Foundation, which is Pacifica Radio, FM radio. While it's listener-sponsored, they're on the board of directors and can push Dialogue Conspiracy or Mae Brussell off the air when she gets too close to the truth. Now, what Nixon's committee did, and Mr. Whitehead, who's now in charge of Hughes satellite communication, was to shape the whole tone of public broadcasting so that today they can't run without the corporations, and the corporations will give you the Metropolitan Opera and upstairs, downstairs, and stories of the King of England and Edward and Victoria and all the little, the social plots that don't shake anybody's booties and keep everybody happy that they're getting culture in America. Another thing that Richard Nixon did, that he had, his administration had a board which goal was to control the corporations, and it was working at the time he resigned in 1974, that they'd have a station program cooperative, and stations would vote for national programs. And he set up an organization that would help him to stop this creeping networkism, he called it, in public broadcasting, which is the bedrock of localism, that they'd set up a board that would determine at a national level. And there were 4 people that he appointed to the board, 4 close ties to Richard Nixon's political control of public broadcasting. And the first on the list was Albert Cole, director of the Reader's Digest, the same person that Ponchitta Pierce worked for the Reader's Digest, and that Mr. Albert Cole was director of the Reader's Digest, and then that was Nixon's first appointee to the board. Then Jack Rather and Thomas Moore and Thomas B. Curtis, former Republican congressman from Missouri. Now take that Reader's Digest connection one step further, because we're going to an important thing which is affecting all of our lives today, which is the control of public broadcasting, where we wanted to get our own kind of stories and news stories, the control of FM stations. The man who wanted to control them is now in charge of the Hughes satellites, and the first man appointed to screen programs of what could be of a national order on public broadcasting was Al Cole of Reader's Digest, whom Ponchitta Pierce worked for, the woman who didn't care whether Rocky was alive or dead, but who was assigned to Rockefeller in 1968 up until the day she was working on a commission of his in 68 when Richard Nixon became the president. Some of you remember, or some of you don't know, that Edward J. Epstein, the man who wrote Inquest, was writing a book on John Kennedy's assassination, and he had an interview with George de Mohrenschildt, a man from the Nazi intelligence, CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, who was Lee Harvey Oswald's intelligence contact in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And Edward Epstein, for Reader's Digest, a book published by them, saw de Mohrenschildt in the morning in Florida, and he was to see him again later in the day. And in the lunch hour, George de Mohrenschildt allegedly commits suicide, shot himself through the mouth, and was killed. On one of my early tapes on Nelson Rockefeller, I said it's possible among the about 11 motives for murdering him at this time was, one, the connection of Nelson Rockefeller to George de Mohrenschildt and to Donald Donaldson, both men that were killed, and also to the disappearance of John Paisley at this time, who worked with these particular people, because Nelson Rockefeller's name was directly linked to these particular men who were murdered this year. Well, there were 3 of them. Paisley's missing. I don't know whether he's dead or just missing. Donaldson and de Mohrenschildt. But I think it's interesting that a man from Reader's Digest was with de Mohrenschildt just prior to the time he died, and that the same person was working for Rockefeller and was with him when he died, and the same person was working with media control at a time that Ponchitta Pierce was working with the media. Megan Marshak was working with the Associated Press, and Ponchitta Pierce was working with CBS News, and she also was working with NBC TV at a time when the media was being curtailed or suppressed. She was also employed by Reader's Digest at one time. The Digest was suppressing free television for us to have access to, and Reader's Digest also had an author with de Mohrenschildt when he was shot, just the same day that he was shot. And I think the conduit of the White House dirty tricks of Richard Nixon is very much intact. You see, Watergate investigated a few dirty tricks, a little bit of hanky-panky. They didn't go into suppression of evidence, destruction of evidence, the Wallace shooting, the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. And the reason they didn't is that to do any one of those things, or the death of Howard Hughes and the secrecy or chicanery of substituting him for Vance Cooper, the reason they didn't do any one of those things is that they would break the chain of command, and the chain of command was intact, so that by 1980 all teams are still working. E. Howard Hunt can still forge documents and get paid off. They can plant documents, they can blackmail people, photograph them, compromise them, murder, and they still have control of the public officials in the news media whom they've also blackmailed and compromised into silence. There were memos in the Richard Nixon alternatives for suppressing news, and there's a quotation here: shaping the corporation, probably no amount of restructuring will entirely eliminate the tendency to support liberal causes. On the other hand, this administration has an opportunity to establish, by legislation or otherwise, structures and counterbalances which will restrain this tendency in future years, and which, as a political matter, it will be difficult for other administrations to alter. It is in this direction that we have been proceeding. You see, Richard Nixon is expendable, but the process was set up just like the Richard Nixon Supreme Court was set up, and that's the important thing to remember, that these eyes-only memos are now released, some of them, and you can see how newscasts were taken off and why public broadcasting has become nothing but an entertainment place that would fold tomorrow if they didn't get the budget for their foundations. Now they have so many employees and scenes and folios and so forth that they can't survive anymore with just public support, so the foundations have a hold on them, and that's the way they call the shots. If you're going to have an alternative media, it will control it. I also mentioned last week that the Westinghouse bought 3 new FM radio stations, and that's one reason I went off KLRB, is that privately owned by a man who has radio stations in Las Vegas and in Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, friendly with the Howard Hughes empire and that satellite connection. And even though the owner didn't tell me what to say or what not to say, I didn't choose to work for that anymore. I was waiting to see what their move would be towards me having this kind of news, and they didn't stop me from being on the air, but I went off because I realized that the station was opt-out for the money people who had come in. In order to hold your jobs, you have to keep quiet, and therefore there wouldn't be a political stand anyway if they were put to the test. So it's a privately owned station playing rock music. A lot of the rock people now linked up to organized crime. District Attorney Robert Morgenthau in Manhattan has conceded that they had an informal inquiry into the questions of Rockefeller's death, but they had uncovered nothing that would warrant a formal investigation. If any of you are so inclined, you can make copies of these tapes on Rockefeller and send them to him, and I'll send him the printed sheets that accompany it and tell him why I think Nelson Rockefeller was murdered. Incidentally, the staff members of the apartment, that cooperative apartment that I call that CIA safe house on 54th Street, 25 West 54th Street, which is a $100,000 a year apartment, the staff members of the apartment building where Marshak and Pierce have apartments have been told that they will lose their jobs and be prevented from finding further work if they discuss Rockefeller's death publicly, according to members of the co-op apartment. Now, these are people that bought apartments for $100,000 on 54th Street that have been told that they will never gain employment in another place. And see, I believe it is a CIA safe house for entertaining ambassadors and journalists and media people from Rockefeller Center, NBC, ABC, the whole network, you see. And I bet you there are many people in New York City that know very well that apartment on 25 West 54th Street that was decorated with Rockefeller artifacts and many ambassadors and prominent people. But the district attorney there says that he's had not enough information to warrant a formal investigation, and yet the people in that apartment have been told that they will lose their jobs and will never again find other work if they discuss publicly what went on in that building. Now, it would be hard to stop an employee of a cooperative apartment from getting work unless the intelligence community had a vested interest in keeping quiet how that house was used. People magazine has an article about Megan Marshak, but there are just two sentences that are worth repeating here. This is February 26, 1979. It said, "She had drive and ambition, could be Megan's middle name. Through bluff or bluster, she always managed to be places she wasn't really credentialed to be. She's a talented lady, but she pushed her way to the top in everything." Now, I don't think you can push your way to the office of the Vice President of the United States just having been in Washington 6 months, or I don't think you can be on the press corps down at San Clemente with Richard Nixon or covering the Sarah Jane Moore story unless the intelligence community put you in that position. It's like Donald Segretti hanging up a hat in a law office and saying he's a lawyer when he's working for the CIA. This woman's drive and ambition is similar to all those White House plumbers that went around doing their dirty work and undermining this government. But she wasn't credentialed. I said that from the very beginning when I asked questions about Megan Marshak. She didn't have the credentials to be where she was, and she had said just before Rockefeller's death that she was ready to move back to California, even though she owned that expensive real estate in New York, and she has been quoted as saying she could retire now. A friend of mine works at Davis, California, and called me. She had heard me at KGO talking about Megan Marshak, and she attended a party last week. Megan was up there visiting her brother. She skipped out of New York without further questioning by any grand jury, and she wasn't in deep mourning. She was at a party last weekend up at Davis, California. She's left since then, but a friend of mine was at a party where she was, and everybody was having a good time. Dr. Michael Baden of the CIA, who I've mentioned on other tapes, had an article in the New York Post saying that he urged Happy to allow an autopsy on Rockefeller. Now, that is so wrong. The New York Medical Examiner urged Happy. Happy doesn't have the decision, and I've made that before, of whether or not to have an early cremation or an autopsy. He said the family wanted the body cremated almost immediately, but he delayed this while trying to convince them to have the autopsy to deal with questions that might arise. I don't believe that Happy had the choice because Dr. Esikoff was not treating him for a heart condition. The doctor who was treating him hasn't been identified, and I don't believe he had a heart condition. And they didn't have to let him have a cremation a day early. They could have kept the body around, and there's no indication of examining that body, as I said before, for stomach fluids or the injection of a poison, cyanide, into his body where he would die very quickly. The New York Post says that Dr. Ernest Esikoff viewed the body at Lenox Hospital and certified he died of a massive heart attack, but now Michael Baden is saying it's possible that other causes of death might have been missed. Can you imagine the discrepancies in this death? And Nelson Rockefeller is taken 22 blocks to a hospital where a specific Dr. Esikoff looks at him and says, yeah, he had a heart attack. Okay, you can have him. You want to cremate him? Go ahead and cremate him. He looked at the body. He viewed the body. And now there's a question of the color of the body. The usual color of a heart attack wasn't there. It was a different color, and there's a discrepancy in the news about the condition of the body because of the color of the body. The paramedics made the statement that his face was not tinged with the bluish discoloration characteristic of heart attack victims, and it was Officer George Frangos, the first policeman to reach him, that said his face was reddish. It wasn't blotched or bluish like a heart attack. And they also made comment that there was wine in his stomach, and yet this Dr. Esikoff, the one from Johannesburg, South Africa, who graduated in 1952 down there, is the recipient of this body, and then this Dr. Esikoff, who just viewed it, he simply walked up and saw it and said, yeah, that's a heart attack, and signed the statement, and there was no autopsy on Nelson Rockefeller. Dr. Michael Baden said that state law mandates that permission for cremation be given from the medical examiner's office, but such approval can be given over a telephone. Remember, I mentioned last week that they simply picked up a call and said, can we do a cremation? And they said yes, and that Dr. Norman Morris double-checked with Dr. Bodden. I told you Dr. Michael Bodden of the CIA was out in San Diego at the time, and they gave permission over the telephone to go ahead and do the cremation. Esikoff covered, he said, I recommended an autopsy. I went back to Happy, and she was upset, and she firmly didn't wish it. Bodden said a medical examiner cannot demand an autopsy. Only a court may order an autopsy if there is suspicion of criminality, and there was none in this case. There was no suspicion, and therefore they could do it. But considering all the assassinations that have taken place, you'd think that there would have been some suspicion unless you worked for the CIA, like Dr. Michael Bodden. The ambulance driver was very concerned when he left. The paramedic left the hospital at Lenox Hospital, and Dr. Esikoff said to him, don't speak any more on this. The matter's closed. Don't talk to anybody and don't say a word. And he was saying the cover-up began with Megan Marshak giving orders at the place and acting very authoritarian. That's when the first problem began. And then he said the next problem was Dr. Esikoff saying, don't discuss this matter, that this was very serious. And he concluded by saying, when you consider what's happened to this country in the last 10 years, that was the wrong thing to say. Of course, he hadn't added it up. It's been 15 years since the mishandled autopsy of President John Kennedy and the murder of John Kennedy. But this is one more electoral manipulation, a wheel behind the democratic process which was eliminated in 1960, and always prior to elections, some very important people get knocked off, and in this case, it was Rockefeller. But the important thing is the California connections, University of Southern California, Ponchitta Pierce, the Reader's Digest connections, NBC, her CBS connections, the fact that she worked for Rockefeller in '68 on a commission and came down and was told Rockefeller had a heart attack, and she walks down, calls 911, and just walks back to her apartment, doesn't even bother to say is he alive or dead or to stay with Megan, disappears, hasn't been interviewed. And since our tape last week, we haven't heard any more about Andrew Hoffman or William Keogh, who was in the ambulance. Hoffman with a walkie-talkie that sent the body to Dr. Esikoff at Lenox Hospital. There's still non-persons in the news. Those questions I asked are not answered, and I won't be happy until they are answered. But I think these connections, these missing years of Ponchitta Pierce should be detailed. That house should be broken open. People should ask what went on. They should have security guards or police and find out who's threatening that they never can find employment if they talk about that building, because that building is the location of hanky-panky that goes into the fact that even your gasoline is going to go on up to $2 and $3 a gallon eventually. The blackmail, the price raises, the price fixing, the oil cartels, those are the places where the decisions for your life are made, in those halls and in those bedrooms, through the blackmail of congressmen and ambassadors. That's where wars are made or won or fought. And we should know what went on in that apartment, who pays for the apartment, who pays these women. Is it our tax money and the CIA? And what in the heck is going on with so much